What's up, everyone? Welcome back to Through the Bible. My name is Rod. We're broadcasting from our remote location, my house, during the coronavirus crisis. But we're here tonight, and we're going to look at the third major prophet. Remember, we've looked at Isaiah, we've looked at Jeremiah. Tonight we're going to look at Ezekiel. Next time we'll be with Daniel, but tonight we're looking at Ezekiel. Now remember, we called Isaiah the thundering prophet, right? And we called Jeremiah the weeping prophet. Well, if Isaiah is a thundering prophet and Jeremiah is a weeping prophet, then Ezekiel can pretty safely be called the weird prophet. And you'll understand why as we get into the book of Ezekiel tonight. Just as all the other major prophets that we looked at so far, and pretty much all the prophets together, Ezekiel lets us know the period of time for which he is operating as a prophet. So if you have your Bibles, turn with me to Ezekiel chapter 1. We're going to start with verse 1 tonight. We're going to go through the whole book of Ezekiel. Well, of course, we'll be skipping a lot, but you'll get the gist of the book of Ezekiel and the prophet Ezekiel here. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1, we're going to be reading from the NIV version. If you have another version, I'm okay with that, but we're going to be reading from the NIV. We have this whole time we've been going through the Bible together. Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1. It says this, says, "In the 13th year, in the 4th month, on the 5th day, while I was among the exiles by the Kebar River," that's in Babylon, "the heavens were open, and I saw visions of God. On the 5th of the month, it was the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin, the word of the Lord came to Ezekiel the priest, the son of Buzi, by the Kebar River in the land of the Babylonians. There the hand of the Lord was on him." And so Ezekiel tells us that he is called to be a prophet on the 5th of the month of the 5th year of the exile of King Jehoiachin. That is 593 BC. And Ezekiel will have a series of 13 specific visions, and he will give us a date for each of those visions. The first one being on July 31st, 593 BC, in which we have just noted, and the final prophecy becoming on April 28th, 573 BC. And so Ezekiel is active as a prophet. And the book of Ezekiel is set during the time period of 593 to 573 BC. And Ezekiel is in Babylon. He is a captive in Babylon the entire time. Now, you should recall that when the Babylonians attack Jerusalem in 605 BC, they take some captives back, right? Daniel is among them. And then the Babylonians, they attack Jerusalem again in 597 BC. Captives are taken then. Ezekiel is taken among them. And then the Babylonians attack a third time. We talked about this the last couple of weeks, on 588 BC, resulting in a 2-year siege on the city of Jerusalem, with Jerusalem falling on August 14, 586 BC. And you'll recall last time when we were looking at Lamentation that siege on Jerusalem was a terrible, terrible, terrible ordeal. And Jeremiah the prophet was an eyewitness to all of the events that took place during that siege. And so we have Jeremiah, we have Ezekiel, and we have Daniel, and they all operate as prophets at the very same time. Right? Jeremiah is in Jerusalem from 626 to 586 BC. That's when he operates as a prophet. Ezekiel is in Babylon, and he operates as a prophet from 593 to 573 BC. And Daniel will be in Babylon from 605 to 539 BC, and that's when he will operate as a prophet. And so they overlap. And they are right together. They are contemporaries, and they know each other. That's important to know. And we noted this in Jeremiah, that Jeremiah writes a letter to the exiles in Babylon, and Daniel quotes from that letter in the book of Daniel. And so they are operating at the same time, that all these historical things are happening, right? They're all operating during this historical context of the Babylonian captivity. The attack on Jerusalem, the fall of Jerusalem, and the captivity that results. They are all operating during this same period of time. But Ezekiel's visions are quite different from those of Daniel and those of Jeremiah. And if we continue, and we'll continue in Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 4, but listen what we have here. We have Ezekiel, and he is by the Kebar River, and while he's at the Kebar River, he has these visions of God. Now, there were other captives along the Kebar River also. The question is, what were they doing at this same time? Well, if you turn with me to Psalms 137 real quick, we will see in that psalm some other captives that are there, and what one of the captives writes during this time that he is captive along the Kebar River. This psalm, Psalm 137, is written during this same exact period of time. He is in exile to Babylon. And we read this in Psalm 137. It says this. It says, by the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. There on the poplars we hung our harps, for there our captors asked us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, sing us one of the songs of Zion. Verse 4, but how can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? If I forget you, Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth if I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. Right? This is a psalm of lament about the loss of Jerusalem, about the loss of the temple, right? About the loss of this promised land. And then look at this, the psalm turns angry. And our psalmist, who is among the exiles, he says this, verse 7. He says, remember, Lord, what the Edomites did on the day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried. Tear it down to its foundations. Daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them, right, smashes their heads against the rocks. Now, usually when we read this psalm in the church, we skip over that portion, right? Typically, we stop before those imprecatory verses at the end of this psalm. But it's certainly something that someone would feel during this time. Think about this. If you had been an eyewitness to all of the events that have taken place during this destruction. Remember, we just read Lamentations. Jeremiah was an eyewitness to all of these events that have taken place. And now you are a captive in Babylon. And think about this, that a good number of people, including those from your family, maybe even your children, have been brutally murdered and killed by the Babylonians. And now you are a slave to Babylon, right? Would you not feel the exact same thing? And that's the beauty of the Psalms, that these Psalms express every single emotion that we have, that we can have with our relationship with God. Think about this, right? Think about why God was so fond of David. Why? Because David was not afraid to pour out his emotions before God, right? That's what's so brilliant about the Psalms. So many of the Psalms is just David pouring out his raw emotions before God, right? Whether it's bitterness or anger or joy, it's all expressed there. And I think that's why God said about David that I love him. Why? Because he is a man after my own heart. Isn't that pretty amazing? Now, let's get back to Ezekiel. All right, while the psalmists are on the waters of Babylon and they're weeping, Ezekiel is by the waters of Babylon and he is seeing visions of God. And let's look at this first vision, Ezekiel chapter 1. In verse 4, it says this. It says, I looked and I saw a windstorm coming out of the north, an immense cloud with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. The center of the fire looked like glowing metal, and in the fire was what looked like 4 living creatures. In appearance, their form was human, but each of them had 4 faces and 4 wings. Their legs were straight. Their feet were like those of a calf and gleamed like burnished bronze. Verse 8, under their wings of their 4 sides, they had human hands. All 4 of them had faces and wings, and the wings of one touched the wings of another. Each one went straight ahead, and they did not turn as they moved. Their faces looked like this. Each of the 4 had the face of a human being. And on the right side, each had a face of a lion. And on the left of the face of an ox. Each also had a face of an eagle. Verse 11, such were the faces. They each had 2 wings spreading up spreading out upward, each wing touching that of the creature on either side, and each had 2 other wings covering its body. Each one went straight ahead. Wherever the Spirit would go, they would go, without turning as they went. The appearance of the living creatures was like burning coals of fire, or like torches. Fire moved back and forth among the creatures. It was bright, and lightning flashed out of it. The creatures sped back and forth like flashes of lightning. Well, you read something like that, and you recognize this, that, man, this is a pretty strange vision that Ezekiel is having. But think about this. Turn with me to Revelations. We hear this same kind of speech once again. If you turn with me way to the last book of the Bible, to Revelations, Revelation chapter 4, it says this. Now, we've said this in the past when looking at the book of Revelations, that the book of Revelations is really the easiest book to read. Understanding this, that you have read the previous 65 books beforehand. Right, providing that you've read the 65 books beforehand, the book of Revelation is a very easy book to read. Why? Because Revelation functions very much like the final chapter of a 2,000-page novel. That is, you could not pick up a 2,000-page novel, read the last chapter, and expect to understand what has occurred, what has happened in the previous chapters beforehand. And it's the same way with the Bible. All right? You cannot simply read the book of Revelations and expect to understand it without reading the previous books beforehand, right? Right, everything that's in there, right? All this supposedly weird imagery and all these strange visions that happen in Revelation. You have to understand this, that there's nothing new that's happening in Revelation whatsoever. And in chapter 4 of Revelation, John writes this, chapter 4, verse 1 of Revelation. It says, after this, that is, after writing these 7 letters to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, John says, I looked, and there before me was a door standing open in heaven. And the voice I had first heard speaking to me like a trumpet said, come up here, and I will show you what must take place after this. After what? After what he's just written, right, to the 7 churches in chapters 2 and 3, right? Understand this, that the book of Revelation is divided into 3 parts, and it's very simple to read. It's very easy to figure out. Why? Because we are told exactly how we are to read the book of Revelations. Right? At chapter 1, verse 19, it says this. It says this, the risen, glorified Christ says this to John. He says, write therefore what you have seen, right? That is the past. What is now? That is what is present at the time that John is writing this. And what will take place later. Right? That is the future. And so write about what was, write about what is, and write about what will be. Right, what was chapter 1 of Revelations. What is, right, that's what's happening during John's time, what he writes in chapters 2 and 3 of Revelations, and in those 7 letters to the 7 churches, and then what will take place in the future, chapters 4 through 22 of Revelation, right? And that's our basic structure for the book of Revelation. And so here in chapter 4, we are in the future part of Revelation. And John is taken to heaven in a vision, and he is given a vision of what will take place. And at verse 2 of chapter 4, it says this, Revelation chapter 2 or chapter 4 verse 2 says, at once I was in the Spirit, and there before me was a throne in heaven with someone sitting on it. And the one who sat there had the appearance of jasper and ruby. A rainbow that shone like an emerald encircled the throne. Surrounding the throne were 24 other thrones, and seated on them were 24 elders. And they were dressed in white and had crowns of gold on their head. And so John is seeing this vision of the throne room of God, and the 24 elders are seating around it. Now, drop down to the middle of verse 6, and it says this. It says, in the center around the throne were 4 living creatures, and they were covered with eyes in front and in back. The first living creature was like a lion, the second was like an ox, the third was like the face of a man, the fourth was like a flying eagle. Each of the 4 living creatures had 6 wings, and was covered with eyes all around, even under its wings. Day and night they never stopped saying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord God Almighty, who was and is to come. And please understand this, that these creatures that John has a vision of in Revelation chapter 4, these are the identical creatures that Ezekiel talks about way back in Ezekiel chapter 1. And so they are introduced in Ezekiel chapter 1, and we see them again on other occasions as well in the scriptures. And so understand this, that this seemingly bizarre imagery that we see at the very end of the Bible in Revelation, we have already encountered it 1,000 years beforehand and 1,000 pages beforehand, 500 years beforehand, and 1,000 pages beforehand in the book of Ezekiel. And we have references to it in other places as we go. And so with that, jump back with me to Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 15. It says this, Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 15. It says, As I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the ground beside each creature with its 4 faces. This was the appearance and structure of the wheels. They sparkled like topaz, and all 4 looked alike. Each appeared to be made like a wheel intersecting a wheel. And as they moved, they would go in any one of the 4 directions the creatures faced. The wheels did not change direction as the creature went. Their rims were high and awesome, and all 4 rims were full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures moved, the wheels moved beside them. Right, and Ezekiel will go into very specific detail, right, very specific description of these 4 living creatures. And again, right, we see these creatures once again the last time in Revelation chapter 4. Well, with this vision, Ezekiel is called to be a prophet. And in chapter 2 of Ezekiel, he says this, Ezekiel chapter 2, verse 1. He says, He said to me, Son of man, stand up on your feet. Right, this is God speaking to Ezekiel. Son of man, stand up on your feet, and I will speak to you. As he spoke, the Spirit came into me, and raised me to my feet, and I heard him speak to me. Verse 3, he said, Son of man, I am sending you to the Israelites, to a rebellious nation that has rebelled against me. They and their ancestors have been in revolt against me to this very day. The people to whom I am sending you are obstinate and stubborn. Say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. And whether they listen to me or fail to listen, why? Because it doesn't make a difference to me at this point. For they are a rebellious people, and they will know that a prophet has been among them. And you, son of man, do not be afraid of them or their words. Do not be afraid, though briars and thorns are all around you, and you live among scorpions. Do not be afraid of what they say or be terrified by them, though they are rebellious people. Remember when God said a similar thing to Jeremiah. Jeremiah broke down and wept, but not so Ezekiel. Ezekiel says, bring it on, Lord. I cannot wait. And in verse 7, it says, you must speak my words to them, whether they listen or fail to listen, for they are rebellious. But you, son of man, listen to what I say to you. Do not rebel like that rebellious people. Open your mouth and eat what I will give you. Verse 9, then I looked and I saw a hand stretched out to me. In it was a scroll which he unrolled before me. On both sides of it were written words of lament and mourning and woe. Ezekiel chapter 3 verse 1. And he said to me, Son of man, eat what is before you. Eat this scroll. Then go and speak to the people of Israel. So I opened my mouth and he gave me the scroll to eat. And then he said to me, Son of man, eat this scroll I am giving you and fill your stomach with it. And so I ate it, and it tastes as sweet as honey in my mouth. Right? This scroll contains the very words of what will happen in these events in Jerusalem. These words will describe the fall of Jerusalem, but in a much greater sense, they will also foreshadow this huge catastrophic events at the end times. And so Ezekiel, he eats the scroll, and Ezekiel loves it. Remember in Revelation, John, way at the end of Revelation, he will be told to eat a scroll as well. Right? This very scroll right, with this very same information, these end time events that are going to take place. John is told to ingest God's words and to understand them. Well, John does eat them, and John says they taste like honey as he's eating them. But afterwards, he says of his stomach that this scroll is making him sick. But not so with Ezekiel, right? Ezekiel is a hard man, right? Ezekiel is much harder than even Isaiah. And Ezekiel, when he eats the scroll, he says, man, I love it. Give me some more. Right? He makes John sick, but not so Ezekiel. Well, Ezekiel is called to be a prophet, and he is given his very first assignment. His very first assignment, chapter 3, verse 24. And what you'll see as you study Ezekiel is that unlike Isaiah, right? Isaiah, who presents his prophecies in a very dramatic format, especially chapters 1 through 35, right? It is this drama that takes place. And very much unlike Jeremiah, who when he presents his prophecies, he presents them first in oral form and then in written form. But in Jeremiah, right, he's very reasonable when he gives out his prophecies. Why? Because Jeremiah loves the people and God gives him the words. And for Jeremiah, it's very difficult for him to even share these words. Why? Because Jeremiah loves the people. Well, God realizes this, that Isaiah, he gives the prophecies in a dramatic form and the people reject it. And Jeremiah, he gives the prophecies in a much more gentler form and much more loving way, and the people reject it. And so with Ezekiel, God gives the words to Ezekiel. And Ezekiel, right, he is a very weird fellow. So God says to Ezekiel, we're going to try something different. We're not going to give it in a dramatic form as Isaiah, right? We're not going to give it in a written and oral form and a much more loving way. No, we're going to give it in some dramatic, some street theater. And it's going to be some weird stuff that you are going to do, Ezekiel. And that's what's going to happen. And here in verse 24 of chapter 3, it says this. Ezekiel chapter 3 verse 24 says, Then the Spirit came into me and raised me to my feet. And he spoke to me and said to me, Go shut yourself inside your house, and you, son of man, they will tie with ropes, and you will be bound so you cannot go out among the people. And I will make your tongue stick to the roof of your mouth so that you will be silent and unable to rebuke them, for they are a rebellious people. But 27, but when I speak to you, I will open your mouth and you shall say to him, This is what the sovereign Lord says. Whoever will listen, let them listen. And whoever will refuse, let them refuse. For they are a rebellious people. So Ezekiel, I am going to tie you up in your house. Right? I'm going to put you in your house. I'm going to tie you up and I'm going to make it so you are unable to speak. And then after a while, Ezekiel, people are going to realize that you haven't been around for a while. And so they're going to go look for you. And when they come look for you, they're going to find you in your house and they're going to find you hog-tied in your house, and they're going to notice that you cannot speak, and they're going to wonder, what has happened to you, Ezekiel? And they'll say, Oh, Ezekiel, what has happened? Oh, you've been tied up. Have you been robbed? Have you been beaten up? What's happened to you, Ezekiel? And at that moment, Ezekiel, I'm going to finally allow you to speak, and when you do, Ezekiel, you are going to excoriate them. You are going to just bury them with God's words. And that might get their attention. But if it doesn't, then in chapter 4, we have street theater number 2. And we're going to check that out in just a moment.